All right, good afternoon, everyone. So I represent our department head, Professor Ko, to chair this seminar on China's foreign aid to Africa, variance and convergence with other donors on the continent. This seminar is part of a series, as you can see, of GIS seminars. I think it's the fifth one. I forgot exactly, or the sixth one we've had since spring this year in 2020, and we are delighted today to give an occasion to our PhD candidate, my PhD candidate, by the way, Evan Tetteh, who is back from Ghana, where he spent most of the year actually, to present some of the results of his field work and research for his PhD on China's foreign aid to Africa. And I think he's going to talk about Ghana, but I think his presentation goes beyond the case of Ghana itself. So he's going to talk for something like 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then we have a Q&A. So please, I hope everybody can hear me. Yes. And I will give him the floor, and then I will chair the Q&A section of this seminar later. All right. So please welcome Evan Tetteh.
Okay, so good afternoon, distinguished professors, academics, and others who have joined us today for the GIS seminar series. So just like my principal supervisor said, I'm Evan Tetteh from Ghana, and my PhD thesis is looking into Chinese aid to Africa and trying to connect it to China-Africa relations and issues that arise from it. So as part of my thesis, this topic or subtopic came out from my thesis, and I'm still trying to get input and feedback. So recently I was in Ghana for some data work, and I got stuck there because of COVID. They told me to do other things. So just like you can all see, the topic of my presentation today is China's foreign aid to Africa. And I'm going to look at the variance and convergence with other donor countries on the continent. So this is the outline, technician. I use the mouse. Oh, okay. All right.
By the mouse, maybe it's going to help.
All right. Good. So this is the outline. I'll be looking at the introduction and background. Then we talk about foreign aid in China policy. Then we look into detail the Chinese engagement in Africa. Then in order to compare it with the other donors, I'm looking at some specific OECD source foreign aid providers. I wouldn't be able to discuss the whole OECD, but I will take cases of certain countries. Then we will also look at two countries from the non-OECD. Then we sort of compare it with China to see the variance and convergence. Then the summary on conclusion will share some ideas on some of the things that I have realized or the data show. So looking at the introduction and background, I briefly talk about the concepts. So the first concept that I'm looking at in my presentation is foreign aid. And it is just the transfer of capital, services, and resources from one donor country to a recipient donor countries. And sometimes they channel it through multilaterals and other organizations to the recipient countries. And it is aimed at promoting economic development and sometimes too for political gains. So we will also be looking at the OECD, which is an organization that was formed in 1961 to stimulate economic growth and progress. Then we look at official development assistance, that's ODA. So even though we have the broad definition of foreign aid, the OECD has streamlined the definition to narrow it to certain aspects that is included in foreign aid. Then we look at China aid, because China has its own peculiarities. It has characteristics in defining its aid. Then we will also look at non-OECD countries, then non-OECD recipient countries from Africa, mostly the sub-Saharan African countries. Then in my thesis, I tried to relate or apply this theory, complex interdependence theory. So in the conclusive part of my presentation, I would like to apply it to the findings. So we could see China as, some will describe China as a revisionist country, or appropriately stated, a rising power country. And as a rising power country, China has development interests in Africa. And as part of the engagement, it involves foreign aid policies and packages. So China was committed to Africa since the 50s, and from the 2000 increased its foreign aid engagements. So brief data says that from 2000 to 2011, about 15 billion USD of project commitments, 73 billion, 15 USD out of the 73 billion were foreign aid components. And to the African countries, almost all the African countries had their shares of this aid components. So my methodology and framework of this paper is trying to look at and illustrate how Chinese aid engagements vary or diverge with other donors on the African continent. And I seek to ask these questions: what is the nature of China's engagement in Africa? Then how is the convergence or divergence with other donor countries? Then within such questions, I also apply the complex interdependence theory. And the methodology is largely a qualitative type and a sort of comparative analysis. And the data sources are academic materials, official documents, and some degree of fieldwork. So within it, we are looking at Africa, then we are looking at Chinese aid, OECD donors, and non-OECD donors. So in most of the papers that I read about Chinese aid or foreign aid, we kind of forget, or maybe intentionally, they don't really give us a historical background to aid. They just jump into the definition of aid. So I want to just briefly capture the evolution of aid from history up to this time. And some researchers have categorized this to a status quo restoring type of aid and status quo maintaining type of aid. So we could see this evident in Greek cities even before Christ, 464 before Christ, where in cases or instances where there are calamities or natural disasters, other allied countries went to the aid of other areas within their union. And we saw this with Greek when they went to help, Sparta went to help Athens because they have that motive of restoring the status quo. We have other parallels in quite modern times, like the Lisbon earthquake, when Britain and France also went to the aid of Portugal because they were playing power politics. Then even the United States during 1812, the Venezuela earthquake too, they went there to help because they have ideological differences against Spain. So these are examples of status quo restoring aid, and it has evolved over the years. In these days, it wouldn't be a military help, but more of incentives with ideological motives, and it can contain multiple players at a time. So for instance, if there should be Ebola or disease outbreak in African countries, it wouldn't be only one power that will be going there. Both rising powers, many other countries will be there to help with their different ideological differences. Then we have another sort of aid since ages, that is the status quo maintaining aid. And we see this example in ancient Rome, where during the Gallic War, because they wanted to protect the existing status quo, they helped the other traditional leaders who fight at the frontier to protect the Union. Then we can also draw lessons from the China's tributary system, where China considered as a superior neighboring country exchanges gifts with other countries in the sub-region. But this sort of aid or gift exchange is like a hierarchical relationship where the superior political power, which is China, receive other things from the less powerful nations, but in return, China gave back. But one thing we see about the gift exchange system is that China gave, or the powerful nation gave, more than they received. So it was a sort of political motivation in preserving the status quo. Then it also, they use that to facilitate trade and cultural exchanges among the surrounding states. Then when we come to pre-colonial Africa and pre-Columbia America too, we also have that gift exchanging system. So these are some of the ancient forms of aid. Then when we come to more modern times, just before the World War II, we had the British Colonial Development Act, followed by Roosevelt's Good Neighbor policy, and these were all intended to give concessional loans to U.S. Export-Import Bank to Latin America. Then it was through that eventually we had the establishment of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which brought about the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And the United States, especially as the leading power in the Western Bloc, used these institutions to sort of provide aid and promote its ideologies, especially during the Cold War rivalry. So they use both bilateral and multilateral agencies to give these aids. And we all know of the popular U.S. Marshall Plan of 1948, and that also eventually brought up the OEEC, which metamorphosed into the OECD in 1960 to 61. So since then, we have policy lines for expanding aid flows, especially to developing countries. And they also brought up the mechanisms that will improve the effectiveness of aid. So this is how we had the OECD countries or the Western Bloc, but eventually we also saw certain countries, especially in more recent years, who are also contributing towards the aid discourse. It's not like this is the first time, or it was 10 years ago that they are giving aid, but their aid involvement has been phenomenal since the year 2000. And these non-OECD countries include India, Brazil, Russia, and even China. But China is peculiar in a way from these other non-OECD countries because of China's economic status and even political status in the world system. So China is giving a lot of aid to various regions, and Chinese aid started with Vietnam and the DPRK, but soon followed by an aid that they gave to Egypt, and afterwards the historical Tanzan Railway, which was a significant project in Africa. And this marked the modern history of Chinese aid. So having looked at the history behind aid into the modern history of even Chinese aid, we now look at foreign aid in China policy, especially for Africa. So China's policy, where it aligns with foreign aid production or producing foreign aid, is basically based on these few policies that I'm going to discuss. And the first one is the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which was elaborated by Zhou Enlai when he was visiting African countries in 1953 to 54. And this is what he talks about, that it has mutual respect and territorial integrity, mutual non-aggression, no interference in internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, then peaceful coexistence. So these are the basic principles of peaceful coexistence elaborated by Zhou Enlai. Then further, in 1964, he again brought up the 8 principles for economic aid and technical assistance. This is more direct to the provision of aid, and it's also talking about basically the same things about equality and mutual benefit. China provide loans with low interest and flexibility of payment, then they help the recipient countries to gain from the loan. And there's one interesting point, the last point that they stated as same living standard for Chinese experts in recipient countries. So they ensure that even when they are providing the aid, the experts that they send in the recipient countries have the same living standard as in their countries. So these are some of the policy principles of Chinese aid. Then in 1996, when China started to become more relevant on the international stage, Jiang Zemin again proposed the 5 points when he toured the African continent, and it was revolving around sincere friendship and considering China as being equal with other developing countries and having the interests of the developing countries at hand. So during the 1990s up to the 2000s, we saw that the relevance of China's foreign aid in China policy was more about diplomatic recognition and geopolitical interest, soft power influence, then economic demands and state needs. So as part of the broader engagement, economic engagement, they also use foreign aid to achieve this purpose or some of these purpose. And in the early 2000s, China created or helped to formulate the China-Africa Cooperation, which became a policy dialogue platform for effective implementation of China-Africa policies and projects. And it has many mechanisms that has officials meeting every 3 years. Then aside that, it also has sub-forums that meet annually or according to their determined time to deliberate on issues and present reports that help to formulate policies and engagements. So finally, we had the China policy paper in 2006. It was sort of an upgrade of Hu Jintao's 2003 6-point policy for Africa. And it was again reiterated in 2015. But one strong point that China made it very bold was that their engagement with the African countries will be based on one China principle as a political foundation. So if you don't even accept that one China principle, there wouldn't be any engagement at all with you. So once that principle is accepted, then all other issues could be considered. So how do they engage with the African countries with aid? They provide an increased assistance with no political strings attached. That's what they claim to. Then they give support to the regional organizations, especially ECOWAS and AU. Then scholarship and educational assisted projects. And they do all these things with sincerity and mutual benefits. So the basic features of China's foreign aid policy in Africa, from my research and my readings, are that they are aimed to build up the capacity for self-reliance and independent development of African country. Then they have that claim of no political condition, that is not using foreign aid to interfere in the internal affairs of the recipient countries. So sometimes I get confused when it is stated that no political conditions, because one China policy itself is a political condition. But it went further to explain that the interference in the recipient countries' internal governance and affairs. Then it maintains that foreign aid is a mutual help between developing countries and bilateral relations. Then they submit to foreign aid in accordance with its national conditions. and adapt foreign aid to development of both domestic and international situations with innovations, reforms, management, and mechanisms for improvement. So as part of the mechanisms for improvement, recently, we've had the China International Development Cooperation Agency, which is the CIDCA, and its main vision or aim is elaborated in the red ink over there. I will speak a little bit about the CIDCA in my end comments. Now let's look at what the data say about Chinese aid in Africa. Then from there, we will look at some brief data about other engagements in Africa. So the first one we are looking at is spending. Worldwide, Chinese global aid increased substantially according to the data that we are having from other research institutions, then data that we can interpret from China's own foreign white paper that they released in 2011 and 2014 about foreign aid. But recently, the China Africa Research Institute also released this Chinese global foreign aid expenditure from 2003 to 2018, and we could see the trend. There was this marginal increase up to around 2015. 2016 came down a little bit. 2017, 2018 also went up. And I think 2018 went up than all the years. So there's the brief about the spending. And 23% of its worldwide development financing, that is over 40% of financing to Africa are aid. So we could see that aid component of Chinese development finance, it's not like aid is not huge in their development finance. The data show that about 23% of all monies that they send outside, about 23% is foreign aid. And out of that 23%, which is foreign aid, over 40% to Africa are foreign aid. So for the world trend, 23% of their development finance is foreign aid, but to Africa, almost 40% is foreign aid. And from 2000 to 2018, China provided about 148 billion total loans to Africa, which is quite closer to their total development financing. So if you see this trend and see that about 148 billion total loans was given to Africa for that period, then around 40% of it is almost aid. Then in 2018 FOCAC, Forum for China-Africa Cooperation, China budgeted 60 billion to be spent on Africa from the year 2018 to 2021. And it stated clearly that about 15 billion of that amount was to be used for foreign aid package over the next 3 years. So that is the standing financial commitment within this era that I'm talking of. That's why I brought that one in. And now, let's see the top 10 recipients of Chinese official development assistance or Chinese foreign aid when you compare it with the definition of foreign aid of the ODA. So in the African continent, so as we can see, all of China's foreign aid, about 45 to 7%, according to their 2014 report, goes to Africa. And this is the world allocation to the other regions. Asia is second. That report came about 6 years ago, but the trend hasn't changed much. Then in Africa, in the whole world, these are the top 10 countries. So when you look at the top 10 countries, you could see that about 80% are in Africa, with the exception of, okay, I would say about 70% or 60%, with the exception of Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and Cuba. So China actually does not state priority countries in providing aid, aside the fact that as for the Democratic Republic of Korea, DPRK, is a priority country, but they do not state any other priority country. But when you look at the trend, you will see that Africa is where they send most of their aid. Then we look at B, aspects and projects. So when they send the aid to Africa, what are the aspects of aid that they send to Africa? And what are the projects that they engage in Africa? So one, we have grants. And grants constitutes less than, probably around 30%, usually around 30% of China's aid. And grant is given freely. So if I give you 20,000 Hong Kong dollars. I've given you everything freely. You don't have to pay anything back. And they use this in these areas, and these are some of the examples that they've done over the years on the African continent in certain countries with the use of grant. Then they also give grant, or they give grant in forms of equipment to the AU and the ECOWAS. So for example, the ECOWAS headquarters, it was built by the Chinese as a grant, gift, free of charge. The AU headquarters was built by the Chinese and furnished with equipment, ultramodern equipment and everything. Yeah, and there was this issue that they said they suspected that after they built it, they brought them equipment that they were using to tap into their conversations and whatever was going on. Yeah, that issue came up. China denied it. It became a popular belief on the African continent. So China also gives interest-free loans, and interest-free loans is relatively smaller, about 8.1% when you look at the trend from 2010 to 2012, according to the Foreign Aid White Paper of 2014. But this is the character of the interest-free loan. They give you 20 years, but with 5 years of use, 5 years grace period, and 10 years repayment. So you don't pay any interest on the loan. And they use interest-free loans for some of these projects, like hospitals, malaria prevention, roads, and stuff. Now we come to concessional loans. China's aid is hugely made up of concessional loans, irrespective of whether it's going to Africa or to other regions. About close to 60% of Chinese aid are concessional loans, and probably in the end, we will see the reason why they mostly give concessional loans. And these concessional loans, I highlighted energy and resources because they channel most to projects that are into energy and natural resources, such as oil and minerals. And where there could be an interest there, they also help us. So that is it about the areas and spending. Then we have, as part of, I'll call it, whether it will be a grant or debt cancellation, is also part of Chinese aid and part of any other engagement in Africa as an aid. So China also, as part of policy, they cancel debts, or there's debt cancellation, mostly on debts incurred by mature interest-free loans. So debt cancellations are restricted to this area, mature interest-free loans. So between 2000 and 2019, we are told that China canceled at least 3.4 billion of debts in Africa, restructured or refinanced approximately 15 billion of debt in Africa between 2000 and 2019. Or in all this, it doesn't involve any concessional loan yet, and this is a recent data. And this recent one is in line with G20 debt service suspension. This policy was brought up about somewhere around July by the G20 nations because of the effect of COVID, and China is trying to go in line with it. And the G20 actually are calling for China to be more transparent with how they will help with this initiative. China is saying it will help, but it will help in its own way with Chinese characteristics. And that's where the G20 is calling for Chinese to be more transparent with their characteristics. So lastly, we see the character and features of Chinese aid. So China aid is quite different in content and practice, probably simpler or change less often. Then include expenses that the OECD may not consider as aid. China, until recently, also financed export credit lines or lines of export credit as aid, which the OECD does not. In a way, it's demand-driven. But one interesting thing which I tend to laugh about Chinese aid is it excludes administrative cost. When we go further, you will see that the OECD aid, they count huge administrative costs as part of the aid. But the Chinese aid, per the mode of delivery, exclude that. Then probably some of the things that may have a question mark is credit facilities tied to goods and services, less transparent with higher level of state intervention or state control. It is government to government arrangement and delivery mostly. Then huge infrastructure projects. China channels their aid into infrastructure projects, including stadia. Like when I went for my first study, I visited about 3 stadiums that were built by the Chinese. And over the years, since 2007, 2008 that they were built, comparing the cost to what we are gaining from the stadium, either economically or socially, you will see that if it were to be my personal money, it will be difficult for me to invest there for that moment. But it has other reasons, probably some other political reasons or long-term economic reasons. Now, we look at the OECD source of aid in Africa. I will go over it briefly. So when we see it, all the OECD countries put together, you will see that the blue line over there, Africa has consistently or almost consistently been the highest region of spending since 1990. Then so this also captures the spending of the 5 top countries, and that is United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Japan. These are the 5 top countries that spend in Africa as OECD countries. Then when you compare it down there, compare the data of US to the others, it's almost more than twice the second next spender or the second next country that spends a lot. I don't know, probably that's one of the reasons why Trump is very angry with some of these spendings, because the US has become like a nursing mother to the world. So if you look at this spending, US spend a lot, even though they are all in the same organization. So I'm looking at the case of the US, Great Britain, France, and Japan, their aid in Africa. And so that of the US is, these are the categories. Then the US is a bilateral delivery is very small. They don't give bilateral government to government delivery that much, but they channel it to the US aid organizations and other NGOs and multilaterals like the World Bank, which also receive around 3% or less. So these are the priority countries over the years or in 2018. When you see the priority countries or the huge countries, the countries that had the huge amount of US aid, Afghanistan was first, Israel second for certain reasons, Jordan, Egypt. But from it, you will see Ethiopia and other countries in the African region. The reason why you see the top 3 to be outside Africa is solely because US aid, the foreign aid package coming from the US, is inclusive of military aid. But when they are defining it in relation to the ODA, Official Development Assistance, for that one they exclude military aid. So their aid to African countries does not include any military aid. It's almost humanitarian and ODA type of aid. But these countries like Afghanistan, Israel, and Jordan, and even Egypt went up because of the military aid inclusive package. And so US, good. So these are the areas of spending in Africa. As you can see, or any places. So as usual with the normal trend, the US spends most in Africa than in any other region. Then these are the things that they channel their aid into. Humanitarian, almost 376 million. USA to, okay, this the case of Ethiopia. I'm starting the case of Ethiopia. So in the year 2019, they spent about 878 million, out of which 704 was directed through the US aid agency. And these are the top activities. The top activities are over there, so I will not go over it. Then these are the top partners. So the US aid spend with top partners, and these are some of the sectors that they are spending going to. So I talk about the administrative cost. Administrative cost is almost fourth on the list, with 33 million US dollars spending for Ethiopia for that reporting year, even more than that which was spent on education, more than what was spent on infrastructure. So OECD source aid actually spent less on infrastructure. Then USA to Nigeria, it also follows almost the same trend. Then we have USA to Ghana, my country. It's also followed the, so in each of the cases, humanitarian aid is top of the list, and administrative cost is somewhere in the middle. Now, we look at British aid in Africa. British behave just like the US, but they are a little bit conservative. The British aid is also channeled through the DFID, and the DFID gives about 70 to 74% of their aid. Then other non-DFID departments also give aid. And their delivery channel is through bilateral and multilateral organizations. And this is a recap of their aid package over the years to Africa. And so currently, Africa gets about 51% of UK aid. And that is in line with the DAC least developed countries policy. That least developed, because we have most of the least developed countries. And this is the graph that shows that Africa received most of UK aid. And these are the top 11 countries over the years. And it includes, it's not that clear, but the first one is Pakistan, followed by Nigeria, Ethiopia, then Syria. Then most of the other countries in there are all African countries. Then these are the spending areas of UK aid. Also, humanitarian aid is at the top, just like in line with the US. And so if you look at the cases of Ethiopia, Nigeria, and other African countries, they give a lot to humanitarian aid. Now, France aid in Africa, last case of the OECD countries. Then I will look at Japan also as an OECD. So France also generally gave a lot of aid to countries, and in 2017, 77% of France aid was grant. So it follows the same trend. The Western givers or the OECD aid give a lot of grants than concessional loan type of aid. So 77% and around 23% as loans. And these are the priority countries of France. And in that priority countries, we have Benin, almost all but two are from Africa. So it also follows the same trend. Africa is a priority area. Then the French government is concentrating in these countries. At least 50%, these priority countries, which 17 are from Africa, they give almost 50% of their aid to them. And their aid is channeled at achieving the sustainable development goals, then democratic governance, economic development, and addressing the current need of climate change. So now we look at Japan. Japan, in a way, is an OECD country, but they have some characters in their giving that tend to be in convergence with some of the Asian countries, where I will discuss at the end. So this is the Japan policy plan or policy strategy for the Indo-Pacific region, and this is that of Africa. So they have core economic plans for the various regions, and for the Ghana regions, we know they have the development of the West African sub-region and with many other projects. And so Japan bears the responsibility, according to their president, that values freedom, rule of law, market economy, and free from force or coercion. So these are the policies that drive Japan aid in Africa. And Japan is a country that ardently hopes to resolve the issues facing Africa. So Japan too gives bilateral aid, just like in line with the OECD countries, and about 23 to the multilaterals, almost the same as that of France. Sub-Saharan Africa accounted for 10% of bilateral ODA in 2018, marginal of 1% from the year before. Then other budgets increased to sub-Saharan Africa, and Japan is focused on private sector investment and public partnership. This is where Japan tends to be in convergence with China, because they tend to, in a way, package aid together with investment, unlike the OECD, other core Western OECD countries, which clearly divide aid or separate aid from investments. So Japan also has another attribute, unlike they channel most of their aid through JICA, Japan International Cooperation Agency. So this is the areas in Ghana that JICA is engaged most. And for the fiscal year 2018, there is JICA spending on the country through aid. Now, let's look at two non-OECD source of aid, and probably we can go to the conclusion and compare. So, India aid in Africa. India is a developing country, just like most of the African countries. Their GDP and their development status is a bit higher than almost all the African countries, probably in line with, or will be the same as South Africa. I'm not very certain. So, Japan aid is based on the Bandung Conference and the non-aligned movement, which brought up the South-South cooperation. So they are in line with that South-South cooperation engagement, which China also policy relies on. So they give aid to most African countries, and their aid is channeled into vocational trainings and other things as stated there. India actually has collaborations on the African continent with other OECD countries like USA and Japan to initiate activities. And then we look at Russia aid in Africa. I chose Russia because Russia is still, it's like when you look at the trend, Russia is trying to come back to Africa, but is struggling because of economic restrictions or their economic status. The economy might not be doing well, but they are still doing their best to register their presence again in Africa. So Russia gives more of multilateral than bilateral, and that is, I was a little bit surprised that Russia collaborates with multilateral agencies more than bilateral. And there's, in 2011, they gave 40% of their aid as bilateral, then 60% to multilateral organizations. And there is the regional distribution of their aid. The highest chunk is in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Then Sub-Saharan Africa is 28%. That is the second. So their priority countries actually is the Commonwealth of Independent States, where a lot of their aid moderately come to Africa. And their priority areas include health, debt relief, and according to OECD report, Russia's annual average contribution to Africa from 2011 to 2015 was about $30 million US, quite moderate actually. And so we will say that Russia actually is outmatched by the OECD countries, China, and even India in terms of aid, investment, and trade in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I would say Russia is getting late to the party, but let's see how they will enjoy the party. So they are not a major source of economic development, but mildly in social intervention programs and debt relief with some level of transparency. I say some level of transparency because Japan actually reports to the OECD. I say Russia actually reports to the OECD, and the OECD confirms that they report there. Though recently they had some few issues with them, but they are still reporting. So that is one good thing about Russia aid to Africa and elsewhere. So I think I've talked a lot. Let's look at what we need most, what we can take away most, and that is the variance and convergence with China's aid with other donor countries on the African continent. So, the first thing I will look at is China's definition and spending areas. It's at variance with that of the OECD's ODA. The way ODA defines the aid, like I defined the concept in the beginning. China's aid for now has not, this is very important, China's aid for now has not yet accepted the new OECD framework. And what is the new OECD framework? They say we are now redefining aid, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't know why it took so long. They are now defining aid as grant equivalent methodology. That means if you give me 50,000 Hong Kong dollars concessionary loan aid, the aid you've given me is not 60,000, but the concession on the aid, the concession on the loan is the aid. So you cannot give me interest-free loan of 50,000 and tell me you're giving me foreign aid of 50,000. The interest that you've taken off the loan is the foreign aid. So this definition or this concept or methodology is accepted by the OECD as a framework from 2018. And this is what is interesting. If that is the case, then we are going to recalculate China's aid. Why? Because a lot of their aid is concessionary loans. And they put all the concessionary loans together to calculate the number of aid they give. So if now we are only going to look at the concession that you have given on the loan to define your aid, then China may not be giving a lot of aid. But that said, China has its own definition. So if China does not accept this framework and they define aid according to their traditional definition, then still we'll be having aid with Chinese characteristics. So they will define it according to their framework, and that will influence how much, or the calculation of how much they give. Then, in the definition also, China includes military spending, and that is another variance with other donors on the continent. Scholarship packages, in fact, we have to thank China. It's been very helpful to we African students. For now, China's scholarship to African students is more than almost all the major Western countries combined. So that's for the Western countries, for now, they don't consider scholarship as foreign aid. Then, but there is the fear they are not doing that just for nothing. It's a long-term development plan of soft power influence and even human resource investment. Good. But we are not also clear where the spending of scholarship, whether they take it from the foreign aid budget or the nation spends it without adding it to the foreign aid budget. So this is another area of variance with other donor agencies. Then China, until recently, had budget lines of credit or lines of credit as aid. But when we look at their new policy from FOCA 2018, they've tried to separate the lines of credit from foreign aid. So this is another aspect of gradual convergence with other donors, or especially the OECD on the African countries. And China excludes donor administration costs, which I like very much. Personally, I like it because a lot of the money you are giving me go to administration costs. And you calculate it as aid to me. But China do not do that. Okay. And China gives more of concessionary loans, which I've talked about, in contrast with most of the OECD countries, which give grants. But this area is slightly aligning with the Asian players, including India and Japan. They also give concessionary loans, although Japan is an OECD country. The likely area of divergence with the latter could be they adopting, the OECD and probably India will be adopting the new grant equivalent that I've talked about. And 3, China engages more with Africa through government-to-government bilateral aid, just like we could see from the presentation. And this is a huge variance with OECD countries. But for the non-OECD, it is still similar to India. But Russia leans more towards multilateral engagement. So probably we might criticize China's approach of that government to government. But when you look at the case and what happens on the ground, it helps towards cutting that administration cost that I've talked about. Because if they do it government to government, it doesn't involve too many intermediaries who spend a lot of their money on their traveling expenses and other personal things. So it cuts administration costs, ensure effective monitoring actually, then it limits corruption, but also exercise some sort of strict, but they use it to exercise some sort of strict control over the aid. Then 4, dedicated aid agency. This is also an area I would say China used to be at variance with the major players, but recently with the creation of SIDCA, China seems to be aligning more with the norm by dedicating a single aid agency to aid projects and the implementation. Then personally I can say this is also a fact that may prove that China is ready to reform aspects of their aid policies, but with gradual approach. Then 5, China converges with almost all major donors, including OECD and non-OECD, in directing the highest percentage of aid to Africa. So this is another area of convergence. They all direct the higher percentage of their aid to Africa. This may simply be for reasons that align with global development goals that seek to use aid in assisting mostly less developed countries, or political advantage of Africa being the region with most countries, or for geopolitical strategies and reasons. But whichever the reason it is, all of them are on the same line of directing most of their aid to Africa. Then, and also with Africa, I recently saw this interesting thing about Ethiopia, and I sent a message to Dr. Kapiata for his view, because he worked at AU and stayed in Ethiopia for a long time. Why is Ethiopia receiving a lot of aid from almost all the players? All the major players, Ethiopia is on their top list of aid recipients, including the OECD, non-OECD, and even China. Probably for now, we can say that, well, Ethiopia falls into the category of countries that are struggling, or they utilize aid well, because actually people are saying Ethiopia's economy, looking at the less natural resources that they have, is doing pretty well. So probably they utilize aid well, and this may also support the claim that China's aid, although may have other motives, but directed to places that it is needed most, because all the other players take it there because it is needed there. But that aside, we can see that Ethiopia is being used as a major conduit for the BRI, or China's new initiative. So then, last but not the least, or among the last ones, China combines aid with investment and trade. They move the aid together with investment and trade. So for example, the Bui Dam in Ghana, which is one of the highest rank spending of China's project on the African continent, about 20% was concessional loan, maybe around 70% was pure commercial loan, then aspects were grants. They put all together into one project. And this is one of the reasons why they say it's difficult to know China's aid. But in most of the cases, they try to show or indicate the aid aspect, although they will not give the detailed spending. Yeah. So this is also an area that we will say there is some sort of variance with the OECD, but they converge with fellow Asian countries. That is the strategy that we discussed. India and even Japan also use in their aid provision. Then some scholars have given reasons why this may be so. According to Buckingham 2009, this is because China wanted to use a strategy that helped them out of poverty to also help Africa, and not because of altruistic motives. Then Lee and Shan, a very prominent scholar, also said that it is aimed at long-term partnership for market, energy, and space with grand strategy of transformation. Then collaboration. China, we can see, probably most don't know, but China is collaborating well with international organizations like those I've mentioned here in implementing their projects and their initiatives on the African continent. And China even collaborates with the OECD as well. If you go to the OECD website, they mention China as a good partner of the OECD. But one thing we've realized where there is variance is China's collaboration with these partners is more of technical assistance and trainings rather than giving money for specific projects. In few cases, however, they gave monies though. So this is another area of interest. But China does not involve NGOs and civil society organizations, especially in the recipient countries, which is another huge area of variance. And about a month ago, I went to interview and Star Ghana Foundation, the founder and the leader of the foundation. And on the course of interview, I asked him, so does China engage you? And he was like, no, it doesn't happen. Even if you invite them, they will not respond. And so I was about to talk about, so can you get money from China? He said, don't even mention about money. They will not help civil society with money. But sometimes we just invite them for our programs, but they hardly get involved. So that is another huge area of variance. Then China focuses more on using aid for infrastructure, less of structured humanitarian activities, like we've seen in the previous slides, but response to emergencies with relief packages, like in the case of Ebola and COVID. So more of their aid, because of the concessionary loan nature, goes into infrastructure, like I've discussed before. They don't have a structured form of humanitarian aid delivery, like the European countries or the West will maybe allocate so percent to emergency or humanitarian. But the Chinese, when there is an emergency for that one, they will come in and help relatively. China's aid is more of tied than most US. And lastly, Chinese aid is less transparent. And this is another huge variance which people are complaining, because with the OECD countries, they have strict reporting and they report to the OECD and they publish it in their aid-related organization website of the country, as well as the OECD also publishes in their end-of-year report. But China has nothing of that sort. They wait till maybe after a year or something, then they bring up a report, and then in the report, you can pick up some things from the report. Then once in a while, they publish some data that is inclusive of other things. But you need to study it very well to be able to get what you need. But fortunately, we have other research organizations who use scholars to track Chinese aid on the African continent to give us the broad perspective of what the case might be. So in the conclusion, China's aid approach in Africa, with arguable consequences, whether positive or negative, is a matter of concern and academic interest for all of us. And China, we may say, is struggling or intentionally struggling. Because why I say intentionally struggling, the reforms they are making, if they want to make it now, they can make it. But according to their policy, they are moving strategically in shaping their aid program. But as to what extent they are willing to engage with other traditional donors and satisfy the needs of recipient countries without compromising their principles is yet to be seen. So this is a matter of balancing their characteristics and principles to aligning more to international norm. So probably in the coming years, they will try to create a balance. Then this is where I didn't talk about my theory much, but I briefly use it to be applied in the conclusion. The theory is that it affirms that complex interdependence affirms that, and my theories of IR professor is here, so if I make a mistake, forgive me. So it affirms that states should voluntarily increase their interconnectedness into a network of arrangements that are complex, political, commercial, and organizational, which mutually reinforces and rewards each other. So that is the theory, that we should use, states should be proactive in using transnational relations, transgovernmental engagement, and effective policies with domestic means, which could lead to decrease in use of coercive power and military force. So we are in an era where we are calling for interdependence or strengthening interdependence, but the complex interdependence in such a way that that interdependence might not be the same, and it wouldn't be same at the same time. That's what the complex. My professor gave me a feedback recently, Professor Cabestan, that complex interdependence might not remain the same between two nations at the same time. It may change. The interdependence between China and the US just a year ago might be looking different this time. So it makes the interdependence complex. So China's relation, this is my final conclusion, China's relation and interconnectedness with the donor countries, as well as the recipient African countries, should be converging. I believe it should be converging to promote an international political economy and development within the complex global system, in which states are expected to be rational with relevance, growth, and development relationship. Then finally, the use of foreign aid by China as part of their broader economic engagement should promote peaceful interdependence, but at the same time, other issues like the national interest, state ideology, political structure, and development models cannot be written off, but should have a character and practice that leans towards the international norm and behavior. So my final conclusion is that, well, one side we are calling for economic interdependence, where we should use liberal channels and interconnectedness, but at the other side, the state involved may also be looking at their interest, their ideology, and their development models. So we should try to see how a rational state will try to balance these two sides, because they wouldn't give up their characteristics completely at one time just to satisfy which others are calling them to. So I believe, in my conclusion, I believe in the provision of aid, China may gradually be moving or converging with other donors, especially in Africa, like we've seen. But this convergence will not be drastic. It might be gradual, and in other areas too, there might not be convergence at all. There will be a variance for a very long time. So this is the end of my presentation. I talked for too long on that time, so please forgive me. And thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Okay, maybe I'm going to sit behind the screen so I can see the questions.
From Zoom.
Yes. I think that's your water.
Thank you.
Water. All right. Let's see. Well, thanks a lot for this very rich and very comprehensive presentation on aid. And I can see a number of questions on the screen. And coming from the same person, well, at least one of them I know is Cyril Bellier, who is the someone working for the AFD, the French Development Agency, based in Hong Kong now. And just maybe a few, because we don't have much time. We have to close at 4 or something. But I would like to sort of maybe start with a few comments, Evans, regarding your presentation, which covers a lot of ground. You want to get your mouse? Oh, yes, maybe just to get. Maybe we should stop sharing or sharing. Okay, all right. Well,
or you can continue. I'm
okay.
just looking at the question here.
All right. Well, a few things very briefly. Status quo. I'm not too convinced by the distinction you've made regarding status quo restoring or yes, emergency aid like disaster relief or humanitarian assistance. It's to restore the status quo. But the other kind, it's not maintaining the status quo. It's development aid. I mean, it's been development aid all the way back to the Marshall Plan, to even before World War II. So that's maybe the major distinction.
Okay.
That's my first point. The second one is you mentioned aid as a concept, which has been used by China. But we had that discussion earlier. And maybe Zhou Enlai, well, by the way, Zhou Enlai went to India, not to Africa in '54, but that's
Yeah, the second one.
but he used the term aid, but then in the '90s and the '20s and the 2000s, the Chinese government preferred to use the term cooperation or development cooperation, and even what you said at the time of Hu Jintao, it was pragmatic cooperation, mutual assistance. So the term aid came back very lately, very recently actually in China as a vocabulary. And even on the ground, now you see a lot of signs in Africa and elsewhere, China aid, and the sign are very much copied on the American, U.S. aid, and now in Chinese is 中国援助, They've adopted that term now.
This university they built in Ghana.
Yep.
And that embossment is big there. So they started embossing it on.
But that's new. That's
Yeah,
new. I mean, so that's my second point. Well, now you've looked at the carries data, which are very useful. And my question, and just a major question, I think, because we keep, and maybe there is no other option but to compare apples and oranges, because we are unable to compare things which are comparable. Still, do you think that you could sort of set up a table where you can even in making some adjustments and using the carrier and other sources data to sort of give us a table of where does China stand compared to the major OECD countries? Because for the OECD countries, it's easy. We use the same benchmark, the same criteria, so it's easy to compare. How much they give, and you've given a nice table with the US and other countries. But would it be possible in one way or another? Maybe it's impossible to sort of fit in China and just to have a better idea of what China is giving altogether. Because you mentioned all the difficulties, concessional loan, if you add up, of course, all the loan, it makes a lot of money, but actually the concessional part or the grant part, because now, and very often it's not made public, it's not that big actually. So China tends to inflate the figures, and China has been good at public diplomacy in inflating the figures of its assistance, where the assistance is maybe not that meaningful. I take your point regarding the convergences with Japan and India, and to sort of stick to some kind of tide aid. I mean, you mentioned at the end tide aid. I think it's very important. You mentioned at the end of your presentation a bit the power politics, and I think you should emphasize the IPE dimension of your research, because the international political economy, clearly there are a lot of politics, a lot of power interests, and I agree with you with convergence. Yes, it's going to be gradual, but it will remain partial, I think, in the coming years. Okay, I stop here. No, one final thing. You should look at Chinese foundations. And I think there are some Chinese foundations, like the Jack Ma Foundation. Well, Jack Ma is in difficulties now, but the Jack Ma Foundation has delivered and donated a lot of masks to Africa. And so in addition to so it's not exclusively the state or the government anymore in China which provides aid, maybe aid in kind rather than aid in money, but aid in kind is very important. So that's something I wanted to mention. Now, finally, Ethiopia. Ethiopia, first of all, is the most populated country in Africa. Apart from Nigeria,
Yeah, sure.
But first of all, it's very more than 100 million people, and secondly, that's where you have the seat of the African Union.
Mm-hmm.
this nation has been courted by great powers for many years, by the US, by China, by Russia, by all countries, all major powers have tried to win over the Ethiopian government. So there's a power competition there. That's one of the reasons that everybody's pouring money in Ethiopia as well. Of course, it's a poor country, but it's developing well. So, I mean, there's a lot of power politics in Ethiopia as well. Okay, I finish on that. Maybe should I go around the table first before taking up the chat questions? Or
maybe chat questions.
yeah, maybe we can go because the chat questions come from some of the. Can you read them inside? Can you? Okay.
Yeah, I can read them.
Can we sort of? Let me see. Can I go up a bit?
No,
No. Maybe can you? Yes. No. I need to go to the. Can you? Do you have the chat question, Terence? Can you sort of go up the list so we can start from the beginning?
Can't see the chat.
Oh no, the chat is here. Let me.
Okay.
Oh, you can do it. Or?
Yeah, I can read it actually.
No, it's here. Oh yeah, well. Oh, yeah.
That's more.
Yes, it's in more. All right, here we are. Okay. So so you can see. Maybe you can see them on the screen here. The first question is coming from Cyril Bellier. Can you elaborate on 23%? I think you mentioned 23% of what is going to China's, yes, worldwide development what is this worldwide development financing? And 40% of it goes to Africa. Can you elaborate first of all on that? It's 23%.
So thank you very much. And that data was actually taken from one of the third parties research organizations, that's aid data, their analysis of China's development finance over the years. And they publish that data on their website. It's one of the reliable organizations that we tend to use for Chinese data. It might not be perfect, but when they say development financing, then I think we are referring to China's monies that go abroad, inclusive of commercial loans and foreign aid type loans. So all other loans together.
So it's 23% of the 148 billion.
That data is over here.
Yeah.
So
Sorry, go ahead. It's better you keep the screen with you.
23% of each worldwide development financing, inclusive of commercial loans. When we talk of development financing,
Wow, that's not really okay.
Yeah. So it's just like a background.
Okay. Can we maybe move to the second question? Here.
Okay. So thank you very much. He says that 23% might look too. Yeah, actually, I agree with him. Like carry, for instance, they do have problem with some of the figures that aid data bring. Yeah, so sometimes aid data figures are a little bit exaggerated. So I tend to share the same view with you. Thank you.
Okay, the second one, indeed, you can add in the context of other major Asian donors, Japan, Korea. You have the same.
Which one? Indeed.
Yeah, the second question.
Okay.
Evaluation, including being at the same time recipient and provider.
The same historical relation, including being at the same time. So it's like a comment. Or,
yes.
Yeah.
Well, is China still a recipient of aid?
Yeah, China is still a recipient.
but very little from the World Bank.
World Bank and other multilateral organizations.
Yes, but how do you define government to government aid? That's a good question. Do you consider the UK aid not government to government?
Okay, Cyril, thank you for your question. So when I talk of government to government, I'm talking of government to government delivery. Like their delivery system is on the higher level of governance. Like the list might be ministerial agreements. So they deliver it directly from the government to the government rather than like in the UK, they channel their aid, most of their aid, to non-governmental organizations, and they go to the grounds themselves to even implement some of the projects.
But the DFID is a government organization.
Yeah, it's an organization, but the delivery.
The delivery.
Yeah, so I'm talking about the
okay,
delivery.
okay. The same for the AFD.
Yeah,
actually,
the same for that. So that's what I'm referring to.
All right. Next question from Conrad Masabo.
So considering my study findings on China aid in relation to OECD, what is your perception of China's strength to tie infrastructure aid with Chinese delivery? Is it not means to retake its money back?
Yes.
Yeah, you ask, it's a perception, so it will still remain a perception. To be frank, I try to look into the theory that I'm applying, and China will not be giving aid to lose completely. They give aid to also get something back. But one thing that I've realized is to be able to make sure that the African or the receiving end, we don't lose completely. We need to strengthen our institutions, we need to strengthen our strategies, and we need to be on our feet. And when we see that things might not help us, we should be able to stand against some of the delivery methods or some of the policies. So I think that perception is there. It's a means of China retaking their money back and probably retaking more than they give. The responsibility lies on us to make sure that that does not happen.
If I can elaborate on that, on
Okay.
your answer, is that if you have that perception, or if a lot of African people have that kind of perception, it kind of backfires against China. I mean, it doesn't improve China's image in Africa. I mean, does it have an impact, or maybe it doesn't?
I think in a way it has an impact. It has. For political reasons, the governments of the day hardly take the views of the populace into consideration. They only talk about the end product, the populist end product. That, oh, we've taken money from China, this is what they are giving us, this is what they are giving us. But hardly do they talk about what we are losing or likely to lose.
Okay, now the next one is someone want to ask question live. Can you go to him? Duke, what is his name? Can he or she introduce?
Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you to Professor Kabe-san for being your supervisor. Professor Kabe-san, by the way, was my examiner for PhD defense.
So can you introduce yourself? I'm sorry.
My name is Diakite Ansuman.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Are you still in Macau?
Yeah, I'm still in Macau. Yeah, exactly.
You're from Guinea. You are from Guinea-Conakry, huh?
Yeah, I'm from Guinea-Conakry, and Professor Kabe-san was the examiner of my PhD thesis, which was on China aid as well.
Oh, good.
So I just have a few comments. First, as a PhD student, of course, I would like to give you a few comments, and then some of them you can answer them. It's about the topic. You know, when you say China foreign aid to Africa and the convergence and variance and convergence with other donors, I think it's a little bit broad. I think Professor Kabesa mentioned also part of it, which kind of OECD donor you are referring to. Because you have 70 OECD donor, each one has, of course, they have a common rules. They work based on those rules within the OECD, but also they have a different peculiarity. Each one are peculiar depending on the interests of the country. So it's quite difficult to come up with the common understanding of what they represent exactly. So that's why I think you have to think carefully how you go into which donor you can focus. Because the second point I want to mention, I went through your presentations. You presented data about the geographical allocations of China aid and the OECD donor aid, the amount of money disbursed in terms of aid and the package provided by China. That's fine, but I don't think it will help you to understand clearly the convergence and the variance between China and the OECD donor, because there are other things aside the amount of aids they provide. There are other things that underline the aid giving the strategy they use, and the impact of those aids. Because it's not about the amounts that are given that you can see the convergence and the variance, but also you need to go beyond that. For example, there are some studies already done comparing China and the traditional donor, including OECD donors. You have a 3 research paper. Myself, I'm working on a research paper comparing traditional and emerging donors. You have a plenty of literature that can help you maybe to focus a little bit on what you can try to contribute. Because it's a PhD thesis, your contribution is, theoretical contribution is important. And therefore, you need to exhaust the literature review clearly to understand what has not been covered yet. Because most of the things you mentioned, some of them are already covered in the literature, so it does not add value as a PhD, okay? So you have to go beyond that and try to see, for example, the motivation underlying their aid giving. Because when you mention the packaging of the packaging aid and investment, this is something that OECD donor like a France used before. You know, France used before. There's a literature on that. And Japan, China learned from Japan, because when Japan was providing aid to China, they was using that strategy, resource for infrastructure. So I give you infrastructures, but in the end, I need to get some resources out of that, right? And when you talk also about African countries, China approach to African countries is not the same. China does not approach resource-rich countries in Africa and non-resource-rich countries in Africa. The strategy are different, the motivations, the focus on development are completely different. So this you have to point out those things, because it helps you to get a clear pictures about what really China aid is in Africa, so that you can see how it's different or similar with OECD donors. And taking into account also that today, with the globalization, of course, of aid policy, China is not as much as different from OECD donors, because China have already an office in Beijing, OECD representative in Beijing, which is helping China in building China aid policy, for example. So there's kind of connection there that exists. That's maybe you need also to look at how those the presence of those offices in China help China to get closer to the standards that OECD members are following, for example. Okay, so those are few comments. I have a lot, but I can just stop there. And again, it was a great presentation. It's a long process. PhD is a long process. You are just starting, and you are in good hands, because Professor Cabessin, I was happy to have him as my examiner, and you being your supervisor, I believe you will do very good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your
All right, so thank you very much for your contributions. I really appreciate it. After the session, I'll probably find ways of getting your contacts, stay in touch with you. So all the points you've mentioned, I've taken them and I will incorporate them into my thesis. But actually, this is not my thesis topic. It's an aspect that I try to cut out of my thesis for the presentation. But it has helped me to get feedback that would help me for the broader work or the thesis. Okay, so thank you very much once again. All your comments, I think, are on good points.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I can see that Cyril Bellier mentioned Kitano's work.
Yeah,
I'm sure you should.
I will look for it.
Look for it.
So probably, please, the Kitano work, you can give me the reference or the year of publication at least.
I think it's yes. I can ask him, but I think you can find it easy. Now, in the room, any question, Vincent or guys? Or
I want to ask something that is not so technical as the questions of the previous people. I imagine that China providing aid without conditionality to the African countries, African governments, is very well received by the African governments, because as opposed to the aid provided by the European Union or the European Union countries, they give you money, but you have to do something in return. democratic institutions, the carrot and the stick approach. I'm wondering what is the perception of Chinese aid for the African public. Recently we saw that the popularity of China across the world has declined sharply. What are the views of Chinese? Do you have any data, any information about the views of the African people about China and Chinese aid?
African view about China.
Okay, so yeah.
But the people, not the governments. The governments, I'm sure that they are very happy.
The people. The view for now, okay, with the no conditionality, I think it's a policy rhetoric.
So no one believe it in Africa?
Well, it's a policy rhetoric because even if you look at the literature, if you say one China policy is a foundation for providing aid, then you move further to say no conditionality. That itself is questionable. Then two, we know that African countries most of the time as a bloc support China on UN issues.
Yes.
So like Africa is their biggest bloc on UN-related political issues. So that no conditionality itself is questionable. Yeah, then I come to the perception. The perception generally does not look good. Generally, because I have spoken to, just like the civil society organization leader I spoke with, and the general public. But for the general public, the commoner on the street, they only hear the few things they hear on the radio. They don't know much. So it's not good, but they care less. The perception is not good, but they don't care that much. But to the elites and those who are closer to governance issues, for them, it's very worrying for them, to be frank.
And I came in late, so I won't ask a question except to congratulate you, Evans, on your performance. I think convergence is a very, very difficult concept. I worked on convergence for quite a few years, actually, in a rather different way. I suppose converging regions in relation to Europe, so it's not exactly the same question. But I think in a way, convergence is always difficult because is convergence, is it an end product? Is it a process? Is it a starting point? I mean, is it an objective? I mean, in fact, I think convergence it's slippery. It's maybe a bit less slippery than trust, which is the thing I talk about most these days, but it is still quite slippery. And I came up with one of the pieces that I worked on a few years ago, and came up with this model, inverted commas, called states of convergence. And in a way, it was just to try and conceptualize what do we really mean by convergence. You know, what are the different? Because clearly there's a political economy region, there's a more constructed reading perhaps, and I think in a sense, I'm not saying read my article because that would be outrageously sort of self-aggrandizing, but in a sense, I think I'll just show you the one table from the article that you might be useful, because I think in a sense, how do we conceptualize convergence? Now this clearly is in the context of China-African relations, but I think as a general concept, convergence is a difficult one, and I think we need to have a very clear steer of, or else we'll fall into the trap of apples and oranges that Professor Cabistan was raising, which again is an old chestnut. It's a mix of metaphors, but it is actually something to bear in mind. You know, what precisely the comparative criteria, and a concept like convergence, I think. It's essential, but I think it's probably in your presentation, so excuse me if I don't. But I think you do need to have a sort of either a precise definition or a set of eventual potential definitions, because if not, you get lost. You know? Okay. It's a nightmare. Actually. You need to really have a sort of, what's the definition?
Yeah.
No, interesting point.
Yeah, very interesting.
If I may just add up on that and elaborate a bit on this question of convergence, just to mention something you haven't mentioned in your presentation, in the why China is so keen to give priority to infrastructures in Africa as elsewhere. But in the case of Africa, it's one of the key objectives of African development. So the kind of, that was part of Denis Capiata's thesis, which is to sort of align China's Africa policy to vision, Africa Vision 2020, 2035 or whatever, and to sort of fit in. That's an element of convergence with other donors like Japan, but also European Union. Everybody is trying to build infrastructure in Africa because that's the foundation of any kind of development for the continent. And then added to that, another element of convergence will be debt. You mentioned debt at one point. You haven't talked about the debt trap diplomacy, and but I think you will have to address this issue in one way or another, because debt. I mean, actually, today African countries are facing increasing debts, not only with China, but also with Europe and other funders. So this debt issue is also maybe another element of conversion between China and the other donors or aid providers in Africa. So that's just to give you a few ideas. All right. If we don't have any other questions, now I hope look forward to hearing the other part of your presentation, maybe in the future, about your case study, which is Ghana. Because in the case of Ghana, you may be able to better answer the questions raised by Diakile from Guinea, because that's really in looking at the detailed cases, you see the motivations behind, you see exactly what the plans, China's plans are. Okay, thanks for that.